And we're recording. So cool. So this is LIP call number 10. And we have a few things on today's agenda. One LIP candidate, just as kind of like a wrap up to see if we want to talk about anything for the poll recap for LIP 52. And then two outstanding LIP candidates, LIP 56 and LIP 25. And the last thing is the open discussion period. So for starters, the update from the last LIP call that we had, we were talking about LIP 52 and the poll was ongoing at the time. And since then, LIP 52, which is the earnings snapshot proposal, has been accepted, finalized, and also deployed alongside LIP 36 on mainnet. So that is in the rearview mirror. And yeah, anybody on the call want to talk about anything pertaining to the poll, the outcome, or any remaining thoughts on LIP 52?
Only two things. One, just quick check. Everything's gone smoothly with the implementation and with the user experience so far. So no issues, no confusion. It's basically working for users.
Yeah, I mean, just anecdotally, that seems to be the case. I think the one update there is that when LIP 52 was deployed, we had noted that the manual claim earnings option exposed in the live peer node CLI wizard shouldn't be used anymore and was going to be removed in an upcoming release. That release should go out today. So after that release goes out, anyone that's using the new release, that option will no longer be exposed. You'll still be able to submit manual transactions if you want to. It's just not going to be supported by the CLI wizard because it's not really recommended. So that's the one update there.
Great. Okay, and then the other thing is just worth noting, both those polls had near unanimous approval in terms of everyone that participated voting yes. So I think that's just a interesting signal for us to be aware of as we embark on some of these kind of long running processes for future updates. All indications so far has been that the community is generally like pretty aligned. So if you recognize that, do we have opportunities to move things along faster than we typically do? I don't think we need a big discussion on that right now, but it's just something to keep in mind.
Yep. Yeah, I think the support for the first poll for LIP 36 was 100%, and the second one was like 99.8 or something like that. So yeah, that makes sense.
I think I know we don't want to get into a whole discussion about it, but I think that on one side, if there's like a lot of engagement, if it's a small community and a lot of engagement off chain, then can be safer to have things move faster on chain. But then but these have been pretty non-contentious issues, so it's hard to tell. Sometimes it takes the thing going to poll before people, oh, wait a second, like I think this is a bad idea. So
right,
yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, this observation holds for the polls that we have put forth thus far, but we should kind of asterisk it, acknowledging that they haven't really been contentious issues, and the situation might be different if it were a different topic matter. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Good point. Cool. If there is nothing else regarding LIP 52, then I think we can put that aside. So I think it's great that that was deployed. And we can move on with the current outstanding candidates that are remaining. So the first one is LIP 56, which is a proposal involving a reward period. I was the original champion of this, and the basic gist of that proposal was to reduce the Ethereum gas cost, overall Ethereum gas costs, for distributing rewards to active orchestrators. So LIP 36 and 52 really targeted all token holders, and this proposal is specifically targeting active orchestrators. So the background on this proposal is that I took a first pass design maybe like a month and a half ago, but there wasn't really much action on that after an initial round of feedback. And since then, Nico has been able to kind of pick up the work on that proposal and try to take a shot at a second pass design, addressing a lot of the feedback and concerns that were expressed the first time around. So I think Nico is probably the best person to talk about where this LIP currently is at, since he's been working on the second pass design. So Nico, would you mind just giving an overview and status update around where you see this proposal?
Yeah, sure. Regarding the status update, it can be really quick, I guess. There was a draft spec shared yesterday internally. This is not complete to share with the entire community yet. It still has some missing details, but the overall ID of the design is confined within the spec. It's currently awaiting some feedback internally, and then we'll probably be able to share this with the community soon. Some of the high-level things that were incorporated in the design currently was that something that we already talked about was that we would like to separate the inflation logic and management out of the Minter contract, so that the Minter contract only has to hold user funds and transfer them and doesn't have to be responsible for inflation management, which should reduce the amount of updates necessary to the Minter contract in the future, which are quite critical as it holds all of the user funds. So we want to update that contract as infrequent as possible. Some other new things in the current design are that instead of, you still have the reward periods as we discussed in the original design. So a reward period would last, for example, 7 days, and you would accumulate your rewards over that reward period instead of having to call reward every day. The main difference is that transcoders will be able to call reward for the entirety of the next reward periods that's coming to claim their rewards for the previous reward period. Previously, that was only possible in the last round of the current reward period. So that gives transcoders a little bit more of a window to actually call reward and not possibly lose their rewards if they miss that reward call on that particular day or rounds. There are some other details. For example, if a transcoder becomes active or deactivated during a reward period, it would still be entitled to rewards for the rounds it was actually active during that reward period. Those are some of the changes there. And yeah, as I mentioned, the spec will hopefully be shared somewhere next week or the week thereafter, and we can probably discuss it more in the next LIP call.
Cool. Thanks for that update. I think my brief initial reaction is that yeah, I think it makes sense to kind of get the feedback that you want before sharing this more broadly. But I don't think it's a bad idea, if you're comfortable with it, to kind of share a rough version earlier rather than later. Just because it's not like this is going to a poll immediately, and it doesn't necessarily need to be kind of like the fully fleshed out version. I think it's okay if it's shared a little bit earlier, as long as you're comfortable with it. So maybe getting some initial feedback and kind of the iteration process can kind of happen publicly, but we'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, that's fine by me as well. I was just probably seeking some validation on the IDs that were new to this design prior to as they were changed as compared to previous iterations. And we also had some new requirements set forth for this new iteration of the design. So yeah, I was just looking for some ID validation, but we can do that publicly as well. That's totally fine by me. Yeah,
I'll leave that up to you. You mentioned new requirements, just so everyone is on the same page. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on what you see as the new requirements for this proposal are?
Oh yeah, well, maybe requirements is sort of a harsh term here, but yeah, as I mentioned earlier, for transcoders to be able to call reward in a broader window than just the last round of the reward period, still being able to earn your rewards if you become deactivated during a reward period for the rounds that you were actually active for, or if you become active for, like, for example, during the last 2 rounds of a reward period, still being eligible for the rewards for those 2 rounds. And the other one is kind of based on some feedback earlier that I gave on the initial spec, which was that the reward calculation should happen retroactively based on your network ownership in each round during the reward periods. Previously, that was the idea was to use the active state during the reward round for a reward period, and we changed that to, I think, more accurately reflect how many rewards are owed to a transcoder. So those are the 3 main things.
Okay, got it. So it sounds like they're kind of properties that you think are desirable from the proposal that you've updated the design with. So I think for people providing feedback on that offline, once they're able to digest everything, they can just keep that in mind that, like, these are the additional properties that you think are desirable.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, properties is probably a better term to use here. They're not really requirements, but they're, yeah, properties of the new design.
Cool, sounds good. Anyone else on the call have any questions or comments for Nico on his work on LIP 56? Cool, then let's move on to the other outstanding LIP candidate that we have, which is LIP 52, which is the extensible governance contract. And this is something that had been worked on actually prior to LIP 36 and 52, but the decision was made to hold off on trying to push that forward, given that gas cost reductions were kind of like the focal point for the community around that time, and it made more sense to focus on 36 and 52 as opposed to introduce a proposal that was less on the minds of a lot of token holders. And this proposal also represents kind of the next milestone that was described in the original governance roadmap proposal that was shared earlier in the spring of this year. And I think at this point, so Nico is the champion of this, and my understanding is that basically everything around this proposal is done, but it's just a question of the timeline for creating the poll and the actual act of creating the poll. I know we talked about this a little bit in the last LIP call, but Nico, do you want to share a little bit about either what we talked about in the last LIP call to fill people in, or kind of if you have any updates on how you're thinking about the timeline for this poll?
Right. So yeah, as you mentioned, everything required for this LIP in terms of implementation is done. And personally, I would like to move this to a vote sooner rather than later, because I think it's worthwhile to have this be implemented on chain before LIP 56 goes to a vote and passes, because that would allow us to have an auditable update script for LIP 56, which, if we migrate to mint some of the inflation logic out of the minter contract, would be more of a complex upgrade requiring multiple steps. And LIP 25 kind of allows us to batch up all of those steps into one transaction and have an auditable script to create that transaction data. So I would very much like to move this to a vote, perhaps starting next week or the week thereafter. So yeah, that was kind of my rough idea.
Yeah, I think, yeah, go ahead, Doug.
I was going to say that the counterbalance to the fact that it maybe makes the LIP 56 upgrade process more auditable or predictable or safer is that for this complex upgrade, we'd be relying on this kind of brand new, yet to be executed in production code base for the first time on something that's pretty pretty high risk. Obviously, just deploying it and making it the owner of the protocol is high risk in the first place. So it would need sufficient vetting and testing beforehand. But I don't know, I see that as a little bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, good point. I think we should definitely have the right measures in place. I think we already do a lot of that by every upgrade that we do. We dry run it on Rinkeby first, and we check what the results are, and we test it. And this LIP has been subject of a security review by an external reviewer as well a while ago, and that's been completed. So I think if we go through our upgrade process and be rigid about the process itself and test everything right, then this should actually be okay.
Which external reviewer reviewed this?
I was an independent contractor that I was connected with that he's the tech lead for Decentraland.
Right, okay, so right, this was not part of the QuantStamp audit. I remember we worked with the contractor, but I couldn't remember if that was also for the other LIP or for this. It was exclusively for this one, is that right?
It was scoped specifically for this one. It was a week-long engagement. Yeah, what I was going to say earlier was that I think it would make sense to open a poll for this next week. I think the one thing that I would note is that I think we mentioned in last LIP call that the interesting thing with LIP 25 is that if you look at the proposal language itself right now, it might feel like this is something that it doesn't really tell a great story around like why someone should care about this proposal, because it's like a highly technical document. But I think what we noted last time was that maybe something to address that is to attach kind of the storytelling summary to the poll when it's created, so that, and I think Gavin made the good point that like we should make the assumption that some people might not even get to the technical document itself, but they might just read the summary. So it's really important for the summary to tell the best possible story around this proposal, which is the best possible story is probably that this is the next milestone in the governance roadmap that we originally shared. So have that be kind of what people focus around in the summary in case they never even make it to the technical document itself. So that feels like maybe a prerequisite that we can address before the poll is open next week, to kind of try to maximize the engagement around this poll, knowing that like standalone, the proposal might be a little opaque to most people.
Yeah, and I don't see why adding a great summary, adjust the timeline for the last call period or anything like that. I think it's fine to add that context right there so people can see it.
Cool. So
yeah, this is likely to be the first poll that really tests our ability to get quorum, I think. Right, there's no immediate tangible benefit that people are getting. And if they have any kind of governance fatigue, this would be the one that they might put off and say, oh, I'll get to it, but then not think to come back and do it. So that'll be an interesting learning experience of how we, achieve quorum for something that's like a stepping stone milestone.
Yeah, for sure. So given that, Nico, do you agree that like the next step here is to update LIP 25 so that the storytelling summary portion is really prominent, like the first thing that you see when you land on that proposal, when you are going to view it in a poll, and then once we have that complete, we can open the poll as soon as that's done at the beginning of next week.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I think that's already on the checklist that we have internally, but yeah, we should do that as soon as possible.
Great. So yeah, I think the timeline for this is looking like beginning of next week. As soon as we have that summary completed, we can open the poll, kick off the poll period, and then move forward. Any other comments or thoughts about LIP 25? Cool. All right, we have It's 1:21, so we've wrapped up the LIP candidate section. We have a short section for open discussion. I actually had a few things that, a few like preliminary ideas that I've been thinking a little bit about that I'd love to share with people, not as like full-fledged discussions, but maybe that we can segue into after the call and then maybe on the next call. But before I get into those, I'm curious if anyone else has anything that they'd like to talk about for the discussion period.
Only with like a lot of our focus on driving demand into the live peer network and kind of increasing the bootstrap supply side of the live peer network. It's like, if you look at the current team priorities for the next couple of months, not a lot of them are like governance related. So, you know, if the community is itching for any updates that they feel are pending or would be really helpful, it might be on the community to actually drive those updates or processes more, like if we look at the next 2 months.
So kind of like a call to action for anyone that's watching this that has their own particular requests from a protocol perspective, that it's probably on them to drive some of those things if they're not directly aligned with driving more demand to the network at the moment.
Yeah.
Cool. Anybody else have anything that they want to bring up? Cool. So yeah, I mean, some of the preliminary ideas that I've been toying around with are kind of all in this category of supply side incentives. So that's actually something that is related to kind of it is related to the current theme of driving more demand to the network, and that what would be helpful to drive more demand to the network is to make sure that we actually have higher quality supply that is able to support that demand. So just various ideas that I've been thinking about are along the lines of like, what are like some of the foundational things that we would need to experiment with additional supply side incentives that actually help support that? Because I think there's an acknowledgement right now that the current incentive structure today does not necessarily result in kind of the type of hasn't yet resulted in the type of computational capacity that you would want to see in order to help scale a network, in order to support demand coming in. I think there's been this thesis that once the demand comes in, the uptick in fees might create that type of dynamic in order to help bring that capacity on. But I think a reliance on that might take us back to like the chicken and egg problem, right? Which is like, well, we'll only be able to kind of see if that capacity comes on once the demand comes in. But thinking about this from a crypto context, like the whole idea of like leveraging inflation in order to bootstrap the supply was to kind of solve that problem to begin with. So I think there's a little bit of a realization, at least among some people, that that problem hasn't quite been solved, but there might be an opportunity to tweak some things or to experiment with a few things to see if like the situation could be improved. So that's kind of like the backdrop that I've been thinking about this with. And I think one thing that I've been thinking about is, I think there's a lot of invested token holders in the network already. There's grant programs that are operated by a community node that has developed kind of a treasury of LPT, if you will, from their operation. And there's other token holders that might also be really heavily invested as well, that have the long-term interest of the network in mind. So I wonder if there's an opportunity to use for some of those token holders to participate in an experiment that is kind of a lead into a potential change in how inflation might be allocated. So the first step isn't to say like, we should change the way that inflation should be allocated on the network, but the first step is to kind of run a small experiment to see if like some of these treasuries that people have developed on their own can be effectively used to distribute tokens to those that actually provide more value on the network. And it might be okay. And I think the neat thing about this experiment is that it can be subjective, right? It's like a personal experiment run by an individual as opposed to something that needs to be applied network-wide. So yeah, that's kind of like the rough idea, like preliminary idea that I've been thinking about. So I just wanted to share that with the group and see if that like sparks any additional thinking with anyone else in the group that we could maybe talk a little more about like right now or offline or maybe in the next LIP call.
So a concrete example, just an idea, would be group of token holders come together and say, we're willing to stake towards node operators that are keeping a 50% reward cut or a 75% reward cut or something, as long as these operators are continuing to pass these benchmarks that show they're performing really well on encoding video or something like that. And they would be forgoing their own like future inflation in order to route you know, a lot of token towards the good contributors.
Yeah, I think that would be a good concrete example. I mean, even like a even more naive and simpler example would just be like if someone did airdrops of tokens to like the people that perform the best, if they have a treasury available to them already. You would get into details around like if you wanted to do this type of airdrop, should the airdrop be in to like a staked state, or is it just like giving these token holders or giving these orchestrators these tokens and as like a free floating balance? I think that's something that you'd have to make a design decision on, but I think that's another really, really simple toy example.
I like the line of thinking as an experiment that's a precursor to like an actual protocol change, right? I think it's going to be easier to pull off if it's like inflationary future rewards versus just handing over value, or I guess you get maybe like more buy-in or more opt-in. Though I don't know if that's a challenge to get enough or if there's pools available that would be easily able to be dedicated to this.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I'm gonna have to drop off right now, but please continue. Happy to riff on this offline too. Cool. All right, I'll see you guys.
Yeah, Doug.
But yeah, I think my last follow-up thought here is that treating these things that we can do as individual token holders on the network as ways to generate substantial evidence when it comes to a larger monetary policy change seems like it could be an effective way to make things more, make a future potential proposal, regardless of what it is, more substantiated by evidence and data, as opposed to speculation on what might the effect on behavior be. Obviously, you'll need to extrapolate outwards because the data set that you get the data set that you get initially might be small, but it's at least evidence that you can point to, as opposed to kind of trying to make a judgment call on decision on changing the monetary policy or distribution logic arbitrarily. So yeah, just wanted to share that a little bit. Yeah, happy to talk about that in the last few minutes if anyone wants to, or we can just follow up about this offline or on the next call.
I'm interested to talk more, maybe off call.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So yeah, let's follow up offline and chat a little more about that. Cool. Anybody else have any other things that they want to discuss before we hop off today? A little bit of a short one this week. All right. Then I think we can wrap things up here today. Thanks everyone for taking the time.